The Town by Conrad Richter. Chapter 1. Toward Evening. Hit all comes with bein' a woman, lamb in his bosom. Sayward awoke this day with the feeling that something had happened to her. What it was, she didn't know as yet, or if it was for better or for worse. But inside of her a change had taken place. She wasn't the same as last month or last year. That much she could tell. She lay beside Porteus, studying this thing out. Twice she recollected she had such a feeling before. The first time when she was no more than a stout chit of a girl. She lived in old Pennsylvania, then with her mammy, pappy, brother, and sisters. She had woke up in the middle of the night, with the singular notion that her life was over and done. Now wasn't that a funny way for a young girl to think? Well, if her time on earth was done, then it was done, she said to herself, and she was much obliged for being told so she could get ready for heaven. It sobered her, but she couldn't say that it frightened her any. She reckoned she could get along in the next life, if she tried, as well as in this one. That day or the next, her pappy came home and told how the squirrels were leaving the country. Before the week was up, her life by the Juniata was over, and she was following the trace westward along with Worth and Jerry, Jenny, and Asha. Wyatt and Sully, lighting out with all they had on their backs, trapsing for another land, saying goodbye to old Pennsylvania, the only state she ever knew up to then, and would never lay eyes on again. The second time she felt such a change inside her was the time she and Porteus got married, not when she stood up and heard Squire Ch1 say the lawful words, nor during the frolic afterwards. No, it came deep in the night, long after all the folks had gone home, all save her and Porteus. They were in the cabin alone. She lay in bed with her new man, sleeping beside her, like he did now. But she had no notion to waste this hour in foolish deadness into the world. No, she wanted to study out what had happened to her tonight. Never before had she known a man, or what it was like. Oh, she had heard enough about it. They was some who played it up to the sky, but as far as she was concerned, it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Just the same, as she lay there, still as a mouse, she could feel the change in her, something she had never known before, a running along her blood and stirring in all her veins. And if she didn't know it then, she did a couple of months afterward, that it was life. Now this third time she wouldn't be sure. Not always could you put off death, and she wasn't as young and spry as she used to be. No, she had lived a mighty long time. She was in her late 40s, and she thought her ma'am an old woman when she gave up and died at 37. Now she lay quiet till daylight came, sifting in the window. Then she got up, making no noise. Outside she stopped a minute, on the way to the back house, to look around. This was the top hour of the day, and foolish were them who reckoned it the bottom. For the world, like a human, rested up at night, and that's why it was never so fresh after the first hour of the morning. The fields looked as if they just came out of the dye kettle. The town lay like it always lay there, with 2 streets already on the river bank, and crossway streets at either end, reaching out and closing her place in, just to see it made her feel old for fair. Why, when she came here as a girl, all this was solid woods, not a white folks' cabin for miles, east or west, south to the forks, or north toward the English lakes. Anywhere you turned, the trees stood so close and thick that Jerry had to suck for breath. The first year you hardly saw another white person. These days folks were always stopping off from their old states to settle down at Moonshine Church. When she came back in, the fire looked like it was out, but she knew there would be coals a-glowing and winking down under the ash, and that the water in the big kettle would still be good and warm. The others could lay abed a while, till she washed herself all over, for so busy was she Saturday and Saturday night, with 10 others to get washed, that she had to wait for Sunday morning, when it was generally too chilly for these younger ones. She pulled off her old robe and bedgown. Let the girls look down the loft hole at their mam naked if they liked. They would only see how they'd look themselves 30 or 40 years hence. Now why, she wondered, did a woman's hams have to get heavy just when she needed them supple and light the most? Could those hams spell out that no more child would rise up between them? And why did her breast, that used to be stout as wood ducks, hang down now like old shook-out meal bags? 10 babes, counting the one that lay over yonder in the burying ground, had drunk from those bags months on end. Were those tits a-telling her now that they didn't have to stand up and feed greedy mouths any more? Was that it? Was that the change that had come on her, that never could she give flesh, blood, and breath to a squalling young one again? 7 years back she would have thanked her lucky stars to know she had no more on the way, and never could have another even if she wanted. But now that she was a scutched tree, that it had come true like winter or taxes, she didn't know as she liked it so much. Not that she could do anything about it. Never could you go back once the door closed behind you. You could dig in your heels and grab holt if you wanted, but you had to go on. Even them that had to pass to another world went without making too much fuss about it. As soon as she had her clothes on, she called the boys from the loft over her and Porteus's room, for they had chores to do. Resolve the first, a man already, and a lawyer like his pappy. Then Gordon, with his Yankee gimber jaw, always a scheming to get out of work, like his grandpappy Luckett. Next, freckled Kinsey, who was going on an appointment to the Government Academy at Annapolis in the fall. Then it was the girl's turn. Huldah, sly as a young fisher fox, with her black eyes and eye winkers. Next, Libby, with her fine hazel eyes, fat bottom, and teasing ways. Sooth, who would be a beauty some day, with her white skin, red hair, and sweet mouth. And Desia, 10 or 11, the little oldest Bay State lady you ever saw. After that she called Porteus, a winking and blinking in the morning like an untamed, uncombed lion with weak eyes. Last of all, she sent one of the girls up for her two littlest, no more than babes, in the manger, both of them unexpected, and coming a long ways after the rest. Massy, who couldn't keep still, and Chancy, who hadn't dare to run, are rubbing their eyes and holding fast to each other, for they were two against the rest. Once they were all in the kitchen, Sayward felt better. Her chances to have more young ones might be gone, but she had made hay while the sun shone. Why, seeing them all come down in the morning made her think of that light-handed professor at the Ferry House last winter, who took more things out of Porteus's old high hat than you could shake a stick at. What's more, Resolve was itching to marry and fetch his bride home. Before she'd know it, there'd be more young ones a-landing at this cabin. She couldn't figure out where they'd put them all. Maybe Porteus was right, and they did need that big house he wanted to put up. Come to think of it, she had no time to think of getting old, or of death, or of how she felt when she was young and spunky. She'd better forget mooning now and get to work. She could be glad her changes had stopped, so she could have all her snap to tend what she had. The wars were over now. The Indians and Old England for the second time were peaceful, but her young ones weren't. They hadn't signed any peace treaties. What was coming, neither they nor her nor anybody else knew, or whether it would be good or bad. But however it came, she had a notion it would be plenty. Chapter 2. The Dark and Ancient Earth. The babe is wise that weepeth being born. Zoroaster. What sin had she done? Sayward asked herself, for that sin to be visited on the youngest of her children. She had asked it ever since he was born. Not that she said it to anybody, just in her own heart. Those she gave birth to before him had been stout and hearty enough. One or two might have been on the slim side, like her sister Jenny used to be. A mite more flesh on their little ribs and haunches wouldn't have hurt, but they had nothing wrong with them. They could fight like wild kits, go it tooth and nail, daylight and dark. Now this last one had come puny and ailing. Miss Covenhoven said she never saw such a delicate babe. She told Sayward right off not to expect to raise him. He was like a flower budded out in the fall before the frost. He had come too late. Sayward should remember that her oldest boy was a grown man before his youngest brother ever lay in her womb. Likely all the best sap had been used up by them that came before. Jenny said, "Did you ever see a boy's flesh so pure? Why, you could look right through at his blue veins, going about their business." Which you weren't supposed to. That's what was the matter with him, she claimed. His thin hide couldn't keep out the chills and fever. Jenny wiped her eyes. He was Heaven's child, that's what he was, and Sayward might as well make up her mind that the Lord wouldn't give him up long. In her heart, Sayward rose up to deny it. That wasn't the Lord talking, it was Jenny Beagle, and nobody had to listen to a woman's say-so. It was true that Chauncey took all the young ones' sickness that came around. Usually he was the first to go down, and the last to be free. He had spells, too, that nobody knew the name of. She told Porteus never to speak the name of any new plague or pox in the house, or Chansey would surely catch it. But that didn't mean he had no chance, that the Lord's black ox had tramped him. No, she had health and stoutness to spare. If he hadn't, and more than one feverish night, she felt it was her will and the Lord's that held him up till morning. Then from daylight on, his 5 sisters could watch and tend him, for their young brother was the apple of their eye, especially when death prowled near. Today Sayward had put him by the window in Porteus's room, and there he would sit for hours, looking out and never opening his mouth. What he saw only he and God knew. Sometimes from his face and the faraway look in his eyes, she thought it must be another world than this that he mostly lived in. Just what world it could be, whether the one he came from or the one he was going to, Sayward did not claim to know. But ever had he such shy ways, even to her, that he made her think of some creature of the deep woods she had known as a girl, one of those wild things that came into the world and went out of it without the benefit of human minds or hands, and while here followed paths no human feet had trod. Porteus wasn't partial to the young ones coming in his office, but Chansey was his clerk, he said. No matter how private a client's law business, the boy could stay and listen if he wanted. He was 4 years old now, and the rheumatism had left his heart too poorly to race around. To see him sitting stock still on his stool while the others tore and ran always bothered Sayward, even when Porteus hoisted him to his back and took him along to town yonder. His puny white body stayed behind like a pack on her heart. The little boy sat by the window. Summer had come out of Kentucky into Ohio, and the window stood open. It was raining. Out through the window he could see his sister Massie and the Patterson girl trying to run between the drops, like his mother said, but never could they. Wet as fish they would come in every time. Now he could run between the drops. Chansey believed if only he could run, he could feel himself small as a tomtit, and thin as paper slipping right through, swimming all the muddy rivers that ran between the potato hills in his mother's garden, and crossing the great lakes in the side yard on a chip for a keel boat, and with a straw for a pole. After a while he heard a whispering at the door to the wind sweep that led to the kitchen. As he looked, the string was stealthily pulled, the door opened, and Massie's white head pushed through. He could see Ellen Patterson's black head close behind her. "Chansey," Massie whispered, though he was looking right at her. Oh, he knew pretty close what she wanted. Only yesterday, when he was sick, Libby had put him on the old cedar bucket in the kitchen to do his business. It sat in a dark corner, and she claimed she couldn't see it was filled with boiling water to scald it. He had risen up with a howl, and all day he had known anguish. Even now his mother had something soft and comforting under him on the stool. "Chansey," Massie whispered again, for she feared her father sitting at his law table with the strange man and little girl before it. Don't it hurt sitting on it all the time? No, he lied, and gave her a dark look to go about her business. but never a ripple marred the innocence of that wide, speculative gaze. "Chancy," she went on, "will you let Ellen see how bad you hurt it?" With great dignity, the little boy made as though he didn't hear. Massey only bent forward and raised her whisper. "Why won't you? She won't hurt it or nothing. You showed it to Aunt Jenny." The little boy shut his eyes to thrust the pain from his mind. It was still raining. He could feel the dampness, like a great mittened hand reaching through the window, touching walls and bed, nudging the desk and cold dark fireplace. Under its dank fingering, he could smell the chinked logs, the bitter ink, and the slept-in odor of his mother's and father's bed. Once he opened his eyes and peeped. They had gone. Near him, at his father's law table, were just the strange man and the strange little girl. She sat white and stiff as a china chick in a glass dish, while the men's deep voices, like bumblebees, droned and rested. Sometimes, when the voices ceased, when all he could hear was the running of the tiny feet of rain on the roof, when the mist rolling over the world outside the window seemed to roll over him too, then the close sheets and blankets smell of his mother's and father's bed took him off somewhere. It was like a path, more like a beam of motes, for he could follow it without feet. Only a moment or two it took, and he was there. This was the effortless place, the unencumbered world. Never did he feel heavy or tired here, for he could leap and run without moving his legs, and speak without his lips. Scarcely did he even think about having a heart, for here he seemed all in one piece. He could do anything he liked. He need only wish for a thing, and there it was, more wonderful than he had any notion, and sometimes in colors he never saw before, and the people mostly were like nobody he had ever noticed around Moonshine Church. They knew what he wanted to say before he said it. Why then, he wondered, could he never recollect just what they said that pleased him, or what they showed him that gave him wonder? So long as he stayed in the effortless place, all was crystal clear, but once he got back, a mist lay on his mind, and he couldn't remember till something brought it up. Perhaps it was a strange face in town, or the sunset sky, with painted clouds, banked like continents, with stretches of bottomless green sea between. Then some memory returned like a flash and was gone, leaving that indescribably blissful feel of the dream world like a soft, phosphorescent glow behind. It was always a dark moment when something tore him away from that world. Today he sat very still on his rude stool, struggling with the black feelings he ever found waiting to spring out at him from the shadows of the cabin when he got back. Often had he wrestled with these old enemies before, the heavy rain feeling, the melancholy gray sky feeling, the sad old sooty fireplace feeling, and the sick and bloody earth feeling, while all the time something like a severed muscle in his chest palpitated and quivered. Then he heard the sound again, and knew what fetched him back. It was the strange little girl's father crying out loud. Oh, that was a terrible sound for a small boy to hear, a grown-up man giving way to his feelings. His hair was rough and brown, but it could not disguise his narrow, gentle head. He held it to one side tenderly. His eyes were sad and brooding. He looked like a man who had never laid a hand to a tool in his life. He was afraid, he cried to Chansey's father. Never had he known anything like the forest out here, choked with monster trees and vines. He was afraid his strength would not hold out till his place was cleared and the ground planted to keep his loved ones alive. Chansey saw the little girl look up at her father with sudden terror, holding fast to his white hand lest she lose him. And how, then, would she ever find her way back to her mother, sisters, and brothers again? Chansey could see it all as the man sobbed. The bright house they had left in the eastern city, and now the dim hut in these western woods, with the wild solitude shutting them in. Did his mother hear the man cry out? The little boy wondered. She had mighty sharp ears and heard a great deal more than she let on. Mostly, when she wanted anything in this room, she sent one of the girls in. But today the door from the wind sweep opened, and there she stood herself in a clean apron. Her face was grave, but her eyes looked mild at the man who had cried out, and at his little girl. "Supper's ready. I'd like you folks to stay," she said. The man and his little girl got up quickly. They were like two rabbits in the woods, ready to break and run at the sound of a foot in the brush. "I have plenty, and won't make company of you," Chansey's mother promised. But the man and his little girl couldn't stay, he said. They were away from their place in the woods too long now. They had just come to see about title and deed to his land. It would be dark before they got home as it was. The rest of the family was back there in the woods alone, and would be worried if they didn't come. No, they couldn't stay, even for the special dishes. Chansey saw water come to the little girl's mouth at the sound of sweet milk, but her eyes stayed fast on her father's face, and her feet were ready with his to go. They couldn't leave quick enough, and off they went. Chansey stood at the office door, something in him hurting as he watched them go. The man who had cried out he was afraid, and his little girl holding fast to his hairy white hand. When the mist swallowed them up, the boy felt an inconsolable loss. Sooner would he have gone with them if he could, for he knew just how they felt in this gloomy and alien world. His mother had to call him twice for supper, and then Massey was obliged to fetch him. Still he went slowly. He was loath to leave those two out there where he could not see them. He didn't want to break the cord that stretched from his heart to theirs, departing in the mist and rain. He felt closer to them than his own family. Oh, never would he breathe a word of this, even to Massey, but in his heart he knew that those he lived with here in this house were not his real people. No, they were only his foster people, with whom he had been given by his real parents to live. Who his real father and mother were, he did not know, only that they must be like he was. His 3 brothers were old enough to be his uncles, and 4 of his sisters acted like cousins. You could tell they had different blood than he, the way they quarreled and fought, laughed and shouted, ran and jumped, while all he could do was sit out his small puny life on his stool. Now he looked up unwillingly as Massey dragged him in. There they were, as he knew they would be, in a long square around the table, his father in his white collar and black stock standing up to carve, and at the other end his mother in her apron and cap. In between were all the rest, from Resolve down to Desia, and then a gap of years, till you came to Massey and himself. As he climbed his bench, the little boy heard the worst. They were talking about Nilum. A pang went through him at the name. Why couldn't they wait till tomorrow? Then it would be bad enough, but at least the tragedy would be over, and this terrible anguish done. Now he would have to sit and hear them tell again why the Shawanese were killing Nilum. It would be at sunset tonight, just a little time from now. They claimed him the fault of another Indian's death, but the real reason, Chauncey's father said, was that Nilum was too friendly to the whites. Now who would have dreamed that with all the mean and ugly and drunken Indians, it was good, kind Nilum who had to die? More than once Chauncey had seen him out at the barn using their grindstone, or sitting in their kitchen eating his mother's bread. His Indian name was long and hard to say, so the whites called him Nilum. It meant nephew. Chauncey's mother said, once when a family in the woods had nothing to eat, Nilum had carried off the white boy. The family was much afraid, but Nilum sent him back with his pants over his shoulder. Nilum had tied the bottoms of the legs with wang and filled them with corn. I was out and talked to Nilum, Chauncey heard his father tell Resolve. It's an interesting case. Shows you the basic difference between Indian law and ours. The little boy sat hunched and rigid on his bench. Now he would have to hear his father tell the whole terrible story again. How he had gone out to Shawnee town, and Nilum himself said it was no use. Oh, life was sweet to him as any other man who lived, he said, but he was judged guilty by his people and must die. The white people shouldn't try to stop it. If they tried, he and the other Indians would go only deeper in the forest and carry it out just the same, for it was Indian law and custom. He said, you tell white people forget about Nilum. Now I take a rag and wipe away all remembering from white people. Now nobody feel bad about poor Nilum any more. Chauncey wished he had never heard those pitiful words of Nilum, ever since he could see nothing but Nilum kneeling by his open grave, and the father and 3 brothers of the dead Indian firing their rifles into Nilum's breast, just as the sun went down. Oh, this Chauncey knew was why he hated to come back from the dream world to the dark and bloody earth. Once when his mother told him the story, how a family she knew had only 6 grains of corn to eat, he had to cry out for her to stop. His mother had looked at him as if he had done wrong, and now at supper all of them looked at him as if he did wrong, that he couldn't touch his food. How could they eat tonight and talk about Nilum? If you don't like this, you don't know what's good, Huldah told him crossly, taking his plate and cutting the meat finer as if that might be why he had no stomach tonight. As she passed it back, she smacked her red lips over a tidbit from the tenderest portion that her father had served his littlest. You should be thankful, Chauncey. The starving heathen would be very glad for it, Desia preached at him. A man must do his duty at the table, Gordon told him. Your insides are plumb empty. I can hear your big guts a-growlin' at your little ones. Of all who claimed to be his brothers and sisters, only little Massie guessed what ailed him, for she was just a year older than he, and for 2 months every year they were the same age. The stretch of years between them and the others made them closer. "Maybe the Indians will wait tonight, Chancy," she whispered, "because they can't tell when the sun goes down in the rain." Something inside the little boy rose instantly, and with it a flood of feeling. It shot from his eyes like a warm flame, gratefully enveloping Massie. Good old Massie, and now that warm flame that had licked around Massie was enveloping the whole room. For a long moment the brown face of his mother looked beautiful and serene, and the steam curling over her teapot hung like in a picture. A secret inner rosy light glowed from the cherry cupboard, and even the hard earth that had pushed up between the puncheons purred like Aunt Jenny's cat. He could eat a little now, he believed. Strength and well-being rose in him with every bite, for all was well now with Nilum. Not till supper was almost over did he notice the cries of children at play. His spoon halted suddenly in his rigid hand. He listened. The sound of rain on the roof had ceased. From somewhere came a sudden revival of saw and hammer. The ferry bell rang, showing that someone was out and wanting to cross the river, while from some open town door or window a cornet started to play "Christ My All," making sad drawn-out tantarara on the late afternoon air. "It's getting lighter," Huldah said with satisfaction, for she was going out tonight. Their father looked out the window, the mist dissolving into air, into thin air. He declared, and then, as if that reminded him of something, he lifted his head and began reciting half to himself and half to the room in his low, deep courtroom voice. "Our revels now are ended. These are actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air." He didn't stop there, but went on, his deep voice lingering lovingly over the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, and great globe itself. "Yes, all which it inherit shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are of such things as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep." There was something about it that made Chauncey shake with terror. Oh, well he knew what his father meant. It was Nilum's elegy he was giving. The little boy climbed over the bench and stumbled from the table. From the open kitchen door he could begin to see the town through the mist. Once it was all their land, his mother had said, but now there were houses and half a public square. The mist was rising over it in twists and swirls. Already he could make out the different buildings, the brick front of the old store, the 2-story house of the new, the brown shape of the mill. Farther this way loomed the long, low ferry house, the church with the new steeple, the tan yard, and the still house, with smoke floating about like mist. The latter was almost gone now. Rows of houses stood, with their wet roofs shiny under the sky. People were out on the street, with the cows and pigs that had been there all the time, not minding the rain. Up the lane by the academy marched Old Lady Winter's flock of geese, like a row of scholars reciting with their necks stretched out. A faint something caught his eye. At first he didn't know what it was. A patch of color high over the boatyard. He could see clouds through it. Then it grew and blossomed like the tree of life. Another tree of life shot up near the mill. An arc joined them, and there it stood, fragile and dazzling, the mysterious bow of the sky, reminding him of nothing so much as something from that other world he knew. It shone with color, yet nobody painted it, nothing held it up, and nothing could tear it down except God. Ta-ra-ra played the horn. He could hear town children squealing with delight, but Chauncey's heart went cold. Never had he thought he would sometimes dread to see a bow in the sky, but now he thought he couldn't bear it. Not today. Already the sun must be shining up there through the raindrops. His father said, and that's what made the bow. Soon the boy knew the sun must be out everywhere, for the rain was over. Perhaps it was already shining in Shawnee Town, with every Indian watching it sink farther and farther toward earth until it touched the horizon and struck like a hammer. Every moment the little boy thought, the bow must fade, but the delicate colors lingered like everlasting. The first of the night flocks of wood pigeons, making for their roost, flew under it. The dark ferry crossing the river passed slowly through. Now why did that send a shiver down his spine? He strained his eyes far as he could see. Did the man who had cried and his little girl see it? Where were they in the dark forest now? Why did he keep thinking of and feeling for these two he never saw before? Was it that they knew nothing of Nilum, and with them he would have oblivion and peace? Or could it be, perhaps, that the little girl, like a china chick, might be a sister, his true sister, and the man, who held his narrow head tenderly to one side, was his father kept from him ever since he could remember? He recollected now how the man had smiled to him when first he came and had laid a hand on his head as he passed. The little boy could still feel that hand. The impact of a great secret went over him. It must be he was his real father, he told himself, and that was the reason he had cried. Chapter 3. The Bride's Bed. Beyond that, under their skirts, and there all alike, in the dark you couldn't know one from the next. The time of man. Did a young one, Sayward wondered, ever know how its mother felt for it? Likely not. Perhaps some dark night, long after its mammy was dead and gone, such a one, now grown up, might recollect the glimmer of light around it when it was little. But hardly could it guess how tender its mother had held it in her mind, how loving, how anxious for blessings on it, how constant and everlasting, year in and year out, even when it was a grown man going about his business. She didn't believe in being partial. She did her best to love one like the other, yet you couldn't help but carry the baby of the family around in your heart the most. And when that littlest was puny and ailing, you prayed more times than you could cipher that he might live and have his chance to go through life like the others, for all things were possible to God. Just the same, after she had managed to drag Chauncey alive through ill omen and pestilence, she fretted once or twice that for his sake she might regret it some day. She hated to reckon she had ever gone against the will of God. She felt relieved when it turned out one day that his small lips could talk, and hardly could she hold the gratitude in her heart when she found his little mind flowed clear as spring water. But she didn't like him wanting to be alone so much. Her 8 others throve on sociability and their fellows. Now this last one would sooner drag himself to a window inside or some corner outside with his own self for company. That didn't go down so well with Sayward. Even the Bible said it wasn't good for man to be alone. Didn't she know? Hadn't Chauncey's own pappy been a solitary in the woods when first he came to this western country, holing up in his cabin of buckeye logs, and hearing no voice for weeks on end but his own or some frog's wild croaking? Some went so far as to say he'd still be there if it hadn't been for her. That was nonsense. Also, she didn't like what Jenny hinted, that there might be a queer streak in Porteous's family, and that's why he never breathed a word of his folks, or why he left the Bay State. She told Jenny, mighty quick, there was nothing to it. But to herself she promised that she would do for Chauncey all she had for his pappy, keep him from shutting his mind up in himself, throw what life and living with folks she could his way, for in all mortal creatures she reckoned was a great hankering to live, or never would they have come into this living world. That's how she came to put overnight company into sleep with Chauncey. He might avoid them by day, and hardly speak a word to them even when he ought to, but he could rub shins and elbows with them at night. It would be sociability for him, and it wouldn't hurt him. It might even toughen up his thin skin a little, get used toward all these folks he was put on earth to live with and make the best of. To little Chauncey, night was the dark ages. Of all the torments he found waiting for him in life, nighttime was the worst. To have to lay yourself down in the dark and try to make your thoughts leave your mind and your body give up life for a kind of death. Night came so often and lasted so long. Weekdays had a change on Sunday, and every once in a while on public day. But night had no holiday. Every afternoon, at the melancholy hour, when the shadows started to fall, he could see it waiting. There, ahead of him, the dungeon he would have to lie enchained hand and foot till morning. Could he only run around all day like the others, he believed he might be more satisfied to lie still at night, but to sleep the dark hours through was a trick that baffled him. Never could he get the hang of this strange coma that gripped his brothers and sisters, father and mother, so that until early morning they lay as if struck by lightning, or by some mysterious nocturnal drunkenness, their heavy breathing filling the cabin. Oh, it was hard for a little boy to lie there, wakeful, and think up things to pass the whole living long night. He didn't know what he'd do without the Yankee clock down on the log wall. It never stopped talking to him, gave him something to look forward to, that golden moment at which it struck. Each time he lifted his head from the bolster and counted. At the end he prayed it would strike just once more, and that much nearer morning. Then, when the pitiless silence ensued, his heart always sank, knowing that until he heard it again, the whole eternity of an hour would have to be lived through. Just the same he felt grateful to that clock for staying awake with him and keeping his mind company. A whippoorwill's voice was only part of the darkness, but when the giggers came, they seemed like a piece of day in the night time. He could lie on his floor bed and look out the low window and see their torch light moving like a small sun far over there on the river, and hear the giggers' voices when the wind brought them right. The best was when the blacksmith worked at night to let a keel boat get off in the morning. He thought no sound so cheerful and alive in the dark as that ringing anvil. It put iron in his soul and sweetness in the long black hours to know that some human was awake like himself, that it wasn't wholly a season of gloom and the dead. But the worst was when company came, and he had to give up his bedfellow, Gordon. Hardly a week that some strange man or woman didn't stay overnight in the cabin, and most always Chauncey had to sleep with them. His mother would say something like this: "You're welcome to spend the night, if you don't mind sleeping with Chauncey. He's such a little feller, you'll hardly know he's there." And seldom did they. He might as well have been a lump in the bed tick for all the notice they took of him. But every minute of the long night their presence and parts from head to toe tormented him. Some were worse than others. One night he had to sleep with a hairy man whose spines pierced his tender young flesh like a porcupine whenever he turned or rolled against him. Another time his bedmate was a little dried-up old woman who lay in her place like it was her coffin, never moving or breathing all night that Chauncey could tell, except that every once in a while she made a fine sound like a cat spitting. Now why did the family make such a joke of the awful time he had to sleep with the bride and bridesmen? They came from Spring Valley. Chauncey's father had done some law work for the bridesmen, and the pair had their hearts set on him to do the marrying. When he said he was no squire and couldn't, they were so taken down that Chauncey's mother took pity on them, and sent for the new Squire Matthews, and had the bridal pair to supper afterward. When Chauncey went to bed, they were still in the kitchen. Later he heard them come into the room, and below where his mother and father had their bed. At last he heard his mother say the fateful words: "We'll make you welcome to spend the night, but you'll have to sleep in the loft with Chauncey. He has a bad heart, and we can't move him, but I'm sure you won't mind. He's such a little feller, and don't take up much room." That was the time Chauncey's heart even sank the deepest. Soon Kinsey and Gordon came up. Resolve was out somewhere, and would come in later. The little boy looked sadly at his bedfellow, Gordon, whom he knew would sleep 3 in a bed tonight with his other brothers. He always had to give up his bed with Chauncey when company came, but Gordon acted like it didn't matter to him. "Oh, man, are you going to sleep with a mighty pretty woman tonight?" he told the little boy. "I'd sooner sleep with you," Chauncey said to him. "Shh, don't talk like that. You'll make her feel bad. If she hears you, she likes you. I could tell the way she looked at you at the table." Yes, he could talk that way. He didn't have to sleep with her. He could lay down and sleep with his brothers. Every now and then, while they undressed, he heard Gordon whisper something to Kinsey, or Kinsey to him. He couldn't catch what they said, but they'd snort and gurgle and hold it in till they shook, and that's the way it went, till they had their night shirts on. Then they came over to Chauncey's bed and stood there on their skinny legs, looking down at him. "You better not sleep on your side of the bed tonight, Chauncey," Kinsey told him. "You're supposed to sleep in the middle." "What for?" "So the bed stays in balance. You're such a little feller. If you was on one side and those two on the other, it would throw the whole business out of kilter." "Yes, and so they don't fight too," Gordon put in. "A bride and a bridesman is liable to scrap with each other the first night, and this way you keep each one on his side where he belongs." With grave faces, they lifted their small brother up and set him down squarely in the middle of the bed. Then they left him there, but long after they got in their own bed, Chauncey could hear them whisper and choke together, till in time they grew silent, and after that started to snore. Only he, on this loft, was awake when the bride and bridesman came tiptoeing up. Chauncey peeked. The bride held the candlestick in her hands. It was true what Gordon said, that she was a pretty thing, with snowy skin, brown hair, and a yellow-flowered dress, with tucks and ruffles. Except that she was strange and would constrain him. He didn't mind too much sleeping with her. She looked soft and quiet, and like she wouldn't snore. But why did this old bridesman have to come up too? Why couldn't he sleep outside on the bench, or in the barn on the hay? He looked rough and scaly on the outside as a persimmon butt. The soil of his calling stuck to his hands. So deep was it embedded in the cracks of his skin, it looked as if he never could wash it out. Just to lay eye on him gave the little boy the feeling that if this horny and brushy old plowman ever crawled between the sheets, he'd corrode and puncture them, and next morning leave a dark, scaly print of himself on the linen. "You ain't a-goin' to leave him are?" he asked hoarsely. "I think we better," she whispered. She seemed uncertain. "Hold on, how can we get in our bed with that damned tyke in the middle?" "We'll have to," she whispered. "You're supposed to sleep on that side, and me on this." "Not me," the squire said. "We were man and wife, and nobody could part us." "We can't move him on account of his heart. He's asleep, and he won't find out." Chauncey felt the heavy, soil-caked hands under him. "Let me be," the little boy yelled. The snoring of the two grown boys in the other bed stopped abruptly, like halted clocks, then went on. Almost nothing would wake Gordon and Kinsey once they got to sleep. Their mother said they were bad as Limey Hollands, who slept through the time the flood carried his house down the river. The bride pushed the bridesman away. "Now, you better be good," she hissed. Chauncey meditated. She might be little, but she could take care of herself. That was the way with women. They might look slight and mild as butter outside, but inside they were spit and fire. The bride blew out the candle. The little boy could hear them undressing in the dimness. He felt the bride creep lightly in under the covers on one side of him, and while a heavy, grunting crocodile crawled in on the other. Oh, this, the little boy knew, would be the darkest night of his life. He felt like a small fence stretched between a raging lion on one side and a soft white lamb on the other. The nights of the hairy man and the old woman who spat like a cat seemed mild and peaceful now, in comparison. Never had the loft felt so sultry and filled with dark lightning. For a while he tried to make himself thin as a sassafras leaf, lying spaceless and harmless between them, but the soft feel of the bride on one side and the hard scales of the bridesman on the other kept bringing him back to human shape and misery. If only the bridesman had lain still as the bride, but he kept reaching his claws over as if wanting to eat her. "Remember the little feller's heart," she whispered. "It can stop deader'n a doornail for all I care," he growled. "Listen," she halted him. "I don't hear him breathing any more." That held the bridesman, and Chauncey held his breath. On and on he held it till the bride sat up in alarm. He wished he could hold it all night, but in the end he had to let it go with a loud whoosh, and the bride lay down with relief and a sharp warning. But the bridesman wasn't satisfied. If he couldn't torment with his hands, he would with his feet. He would reach one leg over below the little feller and kick at her. It startled Chauncey. He didn't know what to make of it. The picture in the dark of this old man, scaled like a snapping turtle, cavorting himself playfully with his feet, filled the little boy with horror. Once when a horny leg struck him, he gave a loud bleat. Downstairs he heard the creaking ropes of his mother's bed. "Is Chauncey all right, Miss Jones?" she called. Instantly the bride sat up, and her soft hands ran quickly over the little boy's form, till they found his heart. "Why, I think so, ma'am," she called back guardedly. "He must have had a nightmare." "I'm glad it's no worse," the voice said, relieved, and the ropes creaked once more. Now why did his mother call out like that? The little boy wondered. It must have been a warning, for almost never had she done that before. The bride must have reckoned it the same. "Now you lay quiet, Mr. Jones," she whispered, so sharp that Chauncey reckoned it would take all the wildness out of him. But no sooner did he reckon all was still than the bridesman started talking again. "I can't sleep here, and you can't neither," he told her. "I was asleep a half-dozen times already, but you woke me up." She came back tartly. "Now, why don't you settle down and try to go to sleep your own self, Mr. Jones?" He snorted at that, kept thrashing and turning like he couldn't lay still. Once he heard her asleep and breathing peacefully, he jumped up like it made him mad. Chauncey could hear him pulling on his pants and boots. Down the steps he went, feeling his way as if he had to go out bad. The little boy counted the minutes like pearls till he'd come back. How peaceful it seemed. Chauncey had room now to let his body out to its natural size. He could feel the bride lying there softly beside him. Her presence was like the time the strange little girl sat white and fragile as a china chick in his father's office. She and the bride both gave out the same kind of soundless purrings. He could feel them rise up around him like soft streams of quivering tiny marks in the dark air. It acted on him like the hum of bees and flies, made him sink down in the bed. It put over him a kind of spell, as when Massey or Sooth combed his hair. When he woke up, he couldn't believe it. Why, he couldn't remember a night that passed so soon. He never slept, and yet it was daylight, while the last he remembered was the dark. He couldn't even recollect the clock striking 12. Yes, it must be so, for resolve was still out when he minded last, and their resolve snored with his brothers. But where was the bride's man? The bride lay where she had all the time. She was awake now, and likely her stirrings had woke him. In the faraway kitchen he could hear his mother, and now the bride slipped quietly out of bed. Holding her yellow dress around her, she picked up her shoes and stockings, and ran without a sound down the steps. For a long time after she had gone, the boy lay there, tasting the warm pleasure of his bed. It was like basking at the fire. He had actually slept. When he came downstairs, the boys were gone to their chores, and both bride and bridesman had vanished. They were over at the store, his mother said, on their way back to Spring Valley. Chauncey went to the kitchen door, but he couldn't see them. "What time did Mr. Jones get up?" Chauncey's father asked, as he sat down for his breakfast. "All I know is he was sitting on the bench outside the kitchen when I came out, and that was just daylight," Sayward told him. "He couldn't have slept very well," Porteous said. "I think Chauncey kicked him out." Sooth cried, "Is it true, Chauncey, that you slept with the bride all night alone?" Libby teased him. Huldah's black eyes glittered. "I hear that when a baby comes, Miss Jones is going to name him after Chauncey." "Now that's plenty," their mother said sharply, turning on them. "We had enough carrying on for one night." Chapter 4. The Hay Scales. 2 gills a day, the thing is clear. 23 gallons make the year. Old Almanac. It seemed strange, but now that Porteous was away, Chauncey wanted desperately to believe him his real father, for Porteous was at the state capitol, trying to get his bill passed. In his mind, the little boy could see him moving among the legislators in their fine black coats and starched white collars. In his mind's ear, he could hear his father's voice echoing from the Capitol walls, telling that the citizens of Washington Township wanted a county of their own, for now they had to travel days and nights through forest and waters to reach their county seat. Chauncey had heard the story 1,000 times, how this county was vaster than some states, how the folks down at the far end didn't give a hate about them up here in Washington Township, which they reckoned belonged to Canada or Old England perhaps. 4 times he knew his father had taken his bill to the Capitol, and 3 times it had been thrown out. But this year, the girls said, it was sure to go through, and when it did, his father would be one of the new county's 4 judges, and perhaps His Honor, the President Judge himself. All day yesterday, and so far today, the little boy had been sitting at the window, waiting to see his father come riding triumphantly home on his black horse, Brig. Now what would a president judge wear, he wondered. Would he come in a scarlet robe with a 3-cornered hat on his head? And when he kissed him, would he still have that peculiar Swedish tobacco whiskey taste that was his father's? He listened too hard, his sisters said, and that's what gave him his earache, though often had he had it before. Now he let his mother swathe his head in a red flannel rag, sweetened with oil. Still his father didn't come, not until they put him on the bucket in the corner. He could hear Massey racing for the house. What she cried out, He couldn't tell, and there was nobody to tell him, for his sisters hurried to the door and paid no attention when he called. There wasn't even anybody to wipe him. He had to get to the window on his own shaky legs, while his fallen breeches tried to hobble him, and his heart leaped like a crippled rabbit. Now who was that poor sick man a-coming on foot for the house? The little boy wondered. His face was unshaven, his clothes dirtied, and when he walked, he reeled a little from side to side, like a run-down top. Not even the girls must have known him, for they drew back when he came up the step, and in the house. Only Chauncey's mother kept standing at her place like she wasn't scared, and let him greet her. And that's how the little boy knew who it was. He turned bitter eyes on his daughters. "Have you no welcome for your father?" he scourged them. None of them came forward, although Huldah stared at him boldly. "You've been dramming, and you're drunk," she sneered at him. "Yes, but I'm not stupid, Huldah," her father retorted. "You may remember what I tell you. Tomorrow the stupid person will still be stupid, but the drunken man will be sober." His eyes glowed like coals at the boy by the window. "So my little Chauncey is the only one who will kiss me," he said, and the little boy felt a shiver run along his back. He held up his breeches higher, and his face too, blindly, till his father came, and he tasted the sour mixture of tavern doors, of the bucket, of sleeping rooms, and other unknown dregs of the flesh. Oh, how Chauncey asked himself, could he have wished this man staggering to a bench to be his real father? Now his soiled hands fumbled through his pockets and fetched out pipe and pouch. Presently Libby, at her mother's word, brought a hot coal on the fire shovel, and as he drew, his eyes vanished in his stubble till his face became a clay chimney, with the smoke pouring out. "Climb up, and I'll mitigate that torment," he said, and the restless hands pulled the boy to his knee and worked back the rag of flannel. Then his bluish, white-coated lips began plying a soft, soothing stream into the painful ear. All the time Chauncey's sisters stood there, more composed now, but watching and waiting, exchanging looks with each other. You could see them consumed by unspoken questions. Only their mother went about her business as if nothing had happened. "Where is Brig, Papa?" Libby dared at length to ask. "In safe hands," her father answered, between puffs. But he didn't look at her. "The hands of one still more unfortunate than your father, and farther to go." "You sold him?" the girls cried together. Consternation reigned. Even his mother's fingers, busily cleaning his father's hat, were utterly still for a minute. "Then we'll never see Brig again," Sooth cried. "Your saddle too, Papa," Chauncey whimpered. "Would you have me carry it home on my back?" he demanded sternly. "Where did you meet this man in a tavern?" Huldah scorned. "And you had to walk all the way home, Papa," Massey cried. "Then your bill was thrown out again?" Libby asked him. Their father gazed at one after the other with a sovereign disdain. "No, the legislature passed the bill, by a good majority, I may say." Chauncey felt himself slide to the floor as his father got to his feet. Looking up, he saw his father's face twitching in a horrible grimace, and he knew that at last they had got to the place of torment. "Mr. Zephon Brown," he told them. "Him a judge," Libby cried. "Why, he's just a skinflint farmer and tax collector." Nobody else said anything. When Chauncey glanced around, the girls were looking at their father as if this was the lowest degradation of all. In self-defense, he took down the brown jug that hung on the rafter and poured a cup full. The sweetish fumes filled the room, and the fiery liquid spilled down his chin and waistcoat. Afterward, he stood there, inclining a little this way and that, the spasm still distorting one side of his face. "He's also an elder in your mother's church," he told them. Then, with careful dignity, the jug in one hand and pewter cup in the other, he made his way to his office in the front room. That was a painful afternoon. Chauncey's earache was gone, but a greater ache filled his small breast. Aunt Jenny and Miss Weaver, along with others, came to the kitchen. Was it true that Porteous had lost out to Zephyr Brown? They wanted to know. But how did he lose his horse and have to come home afoot? It was Jenny spoke most of the time, and what was Sayward going to do about the load of hay Porteous ordered before he went away? For Zephyr himself was down the road this minute, fetching it, and Sayward would hardly need it now, having fodder for her cows till pasture came in again. The little boy sat tightly on his stool. His mother claimed that God was good and kind, but it looked like God was cruel, playing with his father like a cat with a mouse. First, he had given a fine new horse to his father, as a judge to ride on. Then he took the judgeship away, and now when the hay for this fine horse was coming, he had taken the horse away. Chauncey peered out of the window. How he hated the sight of the triumphant Zephyr, sitting high as he could on his load of hay, driving his best pair of horses. God had not taken Zephyr Brown's horses away. Where the road came nearest the house, he halted his team and called Massie outside to tell her father he was to meet him at the hay scales. Even his hay's come up in the world, Molly Weaver said. He don't want to sell it by the load any more. You better go over your own self, Saird, Jenny warned her sister. He'll skin the eyes off Porteous today. Chauncey's mother made no reply, but the little boy could tell by her face that she had no intention of going, for that would admit to all that his father was drunk and couldn't take care of his own business. She sat bitter-faced and still. Then the other door opened, and Porteous stood there. His eyes were bloodshot, but no blood flowed in his face. His eyes darkened a bit at the sight of his sister-in-law. Then majestically he made his difficult way across the room. "Most potent, grave, and reverend signors, my approved good masters," he said with irony, looking out of the window. With both hands he fitted on his grey beaver hat, which Sayward had meantime cleaned. Then he came toward Chauncey. The little boy had no notion of his intent until he saw Molly Weaver put her hand to her mouth and heard Aunt Jenny draw her breath. "I don't believe I'd take a little feller like him along today, Porteous," Jenny told him. He straightened and stood there, regarding her with those fiery gray-green eyes. "It happens to be my custom to do as I please, Jenny," he informed her. "You can ambulate where you please. You can gossip in every kitchen in town, and probably do. But this lad has been deprived and hindered by the powers that be. I want to show him some of the spiders and scorpions, created by their maker to crawl upon civilization. Over his shoulder, as they went, Chauncey had a glimpse of his mother's cruel face, but never a word of protest from the lines that were her mouth. She was letting him go. Now he would have to see and bear his father's shame and drunkenness in front of the whole town. Once outside, his father set him on his shoulder and his course for the road. The wagon, with its wide, swaying load, had gone on, with his father followed about as unsteadily. Sometimes the little boy found himself almost at the fence on one side, and sometimes almost in the ditch at the other. It was nicer to lay back his head and look at the sky. When he pitched this way, the clouds went flying that, and when he pitched that way, the clouds all came sailing back. It gave him the most extraordinary sensation, where before had he felt the heavens whirling around him like this, the sense of rising and falling in space, while soft blue and white worlds like vast seas floated around him, soothing his ears and dragging his memory with long-forgotten impressions. The hay scales were new and belonged to George Roebuck. They stood by his store, the handsomest spot in town, Chauncey thought, for across the road was the ferry house, and a little beyond the ferry on the slow tide of the river. When Chauncey and his father got there, Zephyr Brown had already driven under the very high shed, with its little roof house far above. Anselm, the clerk, waited as if he expected the driver to get down from the load while they weighed the wagon, but Zephyr's half-closed eye looked back at Porteous reeling after. He gave a little cough, blew himself up a bit, and kept sitting there while Anselm lowered the chains and put one around each hub. The grate clicking windlass turned, the pulleys screeched, the four wheels lifted one by one clear of the ground, and presently you could see Anselm up at the window of the little roof house, moving the weights on the pair of great black steel yards. Now what were the men down here nudging each other for? Chauncey wondered. They had done it ever since Zephyr had kept sitting like a king on the hay. The little boy looked at his father. He seemed to see or understand nothing that was going on. He talked to no one, steadying himself at the hog's head on which he had seated Chauncey. Never had the little boy seen his features so dissolved and run together. Anselm came down with the figures on a scrap of paper. This was the gross weight. This was the weight of the wagon. Porteous paid no attention. Zephyr's black man, Caesar, came up on foot to drive the load off to the Wheeler stable, and Zephyr slid down from the wagon. "Now shall we settle?" he asked, turning his head so that only his half-closed eye was on Chauncey's father. "I'm at your service," he agreed thickly. Zephyr gave his little cough. "I'd like the cash, Porteous." For the first time, Chauncey's father seemed to come out of his lethargy. Cash he fetched out, trying to keep his balance. "Why, there isn't that much cash in the new county. Fortunately, I brought some with me from the old. Shall we retire to the ferry house? We'll seal the bargain with a clincher." More than once Chauncey had been carried by the ferry house, by the tantalizing smells and the sound of the fiddle that came out of it. These had made him itch to see what it was like inside, but now that he was in at last, he felt cheated. Why, it looked bare as a barn, with sand on the floor, a few worn brown benches and tables, and a high counter they called the bar. Even the man behind it, Sam Slopper, the proprietor and ferryman, whom everyone called King Sam, looked disappointing, and today there was no fiddle. Chauncey's father set him on the bar, with his heels hanging down. Zephyr Brown looked disapproving at the little boy, sitting among the mugs and bottles, as if this was a sure way to make a drunkard out of a child. Zephyr and Chauncey's father drank. The men drank from mugs drawn from a mysterious-looking barrel. Chauncey's father reached in pocket after pocket, fetching out silver shillings, paper shimplasters, and bank notes, each of which later Zephyr looked up in his banknote detector. When the money in full lay on the bar, Zephyr Brown stroked his hand over his mouth, as if in apology for the condition of the man with whom he must do business. "You're entirely satisfied, Porteous?" "Oh, I'm perfectly satisfied. I feel I have a bargain. I hope you have no regrets." "Regrets? No, indeed." Zephyr concealed a smile. He carefully drained the last drops from his mug. "Well, I'll have to be going." Chauncey's father seemed almost asleep. Suddenly he woke up. "But you can't do that," he said thickly. "How's that?" Zephyr asked in good humor, as to a child pocketing the money. "Why, you belong to me. I bought you," Porteous told him. In the eyes of the men standing back of his father, Chauncey glimpsed a sudden, wild light of astonishment and exhilaration. Elbows poked into neighbors' ribs. "What do you mean?" Zephyr looked startled. Porteous gave him his sodden and majestic attention. "You acted in this transaction entirely of your own free will, didn't you?" "I don't know what you are talking about," Zephyr protested, but his face had paled. Bracing himself at the bar, Porteous turned further and further until he could gaze direct at the other. Here he stood swaying and making horrible grimaces. "You're an adult sober and in sound mind, aren't you? You had no reservations in adding your own body and weight to that of the hay, did you? You demanded cash payment in full, and received and acknowledged it. Your purpose surely wasn't to cheat me, was it? Not in front of so many of your fellow citizens." Zephyr looked frightened for the first time. If there was anything amiss, Porteous, ignorance is no excuse in the eyes of the law. Chauncey had never seen his father's face so terrifying. Zephyr cast his good eye at the door. "Let me give you some sound and gratuitous advice," Porteous leered at him. "Do not try to escape. It will only be used against you in court." "You can't hold me," Zephyr cried, but he made no move to go. Instead he figured hastily on a piece of paper, then from his pocket counted out a small amount of silver and banknotes on the bar. "If you noticed my forgetfulness, you should have called my attention to the mistake in the first place," he declared angrily. "Not so fast," Porteous said. "You must know that a thief may discharge his debt to his victim after he is caught, but he cannot so easily discharge his debt to the law once it's broken. What'll you take to let him buy himself loose, Porteous?" King Sam behind the bar propounded. Not a shilling. Chauncey's father waved it aside with an unstable hand. The defendant may be willing to traffic in his human soul. I'll have none of it. The only possible condition that might absolve him of duplicity and debt would be for him to solemnly and truthfully swear that he had no intention to charge in the first place, that the hay was a gift bathed with the milk of human kindness and warmed by the sun of human brotherhood. "I'll never do it," Zephin shouted. Porteous turned, his face working in grim and righteous retribution. "I only stated a hypothetical case in which I should be helpless to bring against you charges of sharp practice and connivance, of scheming and intent to defraud, of willful extortion, of acceptance of moneys secured by fraud, and in the event of your running away, of the perfidious breaking of your bond." Never had Chauncey seen such a look on anyone's face as on Zephin Brown's, while hurriedly he counted out a further sum, threw it on the bar, and rushed from the ferry house. The barroom broke into such wild yells of delight as to startle and frighten the little boy. Even on King Sam's wintry face the thin sun of a grin had appeared. Boatmen and loafers surrounded Chauncey's father and shook his hand, while the latter stood like a tipsy king, surrounded by his backwoods court. "It's my intention to treat those present, Sam," he stated. "You may also mix up a little rum and warm milk for the boy." Chauncey wished his father hadn't said that. Now, no matter how much he disliked the taste, he would have to drink it. More than once had he tried the watered whiskey handed out at the house to children on festive occasions. Never could he keep it down long, and this, he knew, would be the same. He would have to throw it up in front of everybody, here or over his father on the way home.